All right, I'm Dr. Michael Phillips. We're continuing our series of lectures on the road to the Civil War, the events that led up to the Civil War. It was a war decades in the making. And we had gotten to the Texas Revolution. And what's a key factor here is that the man who becomes a general of the Texas Army, Sam Houston, who had been a former governor of Tennessee, who resigned very quickly from that post under mysterious circumstances right after his very brief first marriage collapses, was a good friend of Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was U.S. president at the time. And it does seem like they had discussed the possibility of U.S. expansion westward, including Texas. Now, Sam Houston will be in Texas during these critical events. The American Revolution took 7 years. The Texas Revolution took less than 7 months for the Anglos and their Tejano allies to achieve independence from the Mexican state. Now, a lot of myths are going to be surround the Texas Revolution. Much of what Texans think they know is false. I just want to show you this map here. All of this is Mexico at the start of the Mexican Revolution. This is the independent Republic of Texas that will be created as a result of the Mexican Revolution. Note the modern borders have been drawn there, but this is what Texas was originally shaped like. So, we had a president of Mexico who was also the general of the army, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And so let me show you him. He's going to be one of the most important figures in early Mexican history. There he is. Dictators love giving themselves medals. Santa Anna was not a particularly competent general. He had actually won a lot of admiration for his role in Mexico achieving independence from Spain. But nevertheless, he had grandiose notions of his abilities. And he liked to call himself the Napoleon of the West. Of course, Napoleon ultimately lost too. But Napoleon was more successful in the battlefield than Santa Anna. The war will feature massacres by Anglos of Mexicans and Mexicans of Anglos. You will have a massacre, for instance, at Goliad, a prisoner's war, Anglos prisoners' war. There will be a massacre at the end of the Battle of the Alamo, and ultimately the last battle of the Texas Revolution, the Battle of San Jacinto. Most of the Mexican casualties in that battle will take place after the Mexican troops have surrendered. They'll have their arms up and white Texans will just slaughter them. That's not typically told in Texas classrooms, and they certainly don't tell that story when they talk about the Texas Revolution at the Alamo itself, which has always struck me. If you go to San Antonio, you go to the battle, or you go to the Alamo, at least the last time I was there is a sign that says the Shrine of Texas Liberty. And it's important to realize that the men who led the troops at the Alamo, the Anglo troops, were slave traders. In other words, people who kidnapped human beings and sold them on the marketplace, bought others, transported them, sold them for a higher price. Jim Bowie was one of those, one of the heroes of the Alamo. There were men at the Alamo who didn't own slaves, but they wanted to own slaves. And you have to ask the question, how do you fight for liberty if you're enslaving other people? But nevertheless, one of the key moments that's really going to have a profound effect on how Americans are going to see Mexicans and Mexican Americans is the Battle of the Alamo, March 6, 1836. There are 187 men inside the Alamo when the battle commences. Virtually every single one is going to die. One of the casualties will be Davy Crockett, who was already famous. He had been a member of Congress. There were books, fictional books published about Davy Crockett during his lifetime, in which superhuman traits and acts of heroism were attributed to him, all fiction. And of course, there's this famous painting, which you will see if you ever go to the Alamo, or to Austin, or San Antonio rather. And this is supposed to depict the Battle of the Alamo. All of this is nonsense. Actually, Davy Crockett is shown here bravely swinging his rifle, Old Betsy it was called, and clubbing the Mexicans with it. Actually, he survived the battle itself. He was actually captured as a prisoner of war and executed after the battle was over. So this is seen as totally fictitious. The Anglos, who are foregrounded, they're made to look bigger, clearer. They're the center part. Notice a lot of white shirts, which makes them more angelic. The Mexicans are kind of clouded, with the smoke from the guns and everything, and they're all look desperate, frightened, whatever. None are in heroic pose there. One thing that many people aren't taught about the Alamo is Santa Anna's troops were smaller in number than typically is claimed. They were trying to assault a fort. So the Texas troops were behind a wall. The Mexicans were in open field. Many of Santa Anna's troops were Native Americans from Mexico who, number one, had been forced to fight for Mexico. Many indigenous groups in Mexico didn't want to be subjects to the Mexican Republic. They still saw themselves as an independent people, and they're drafted, they're forced to fight. And many of them speak the language of the Maya, the Yaqui Indians, other Indian groups, and their commanders are speaking Spanish. So there's poor communications within the Mexican troops, and many of those troops are not particularly well armed. So one of the interesting things is, of course, Mexican casualties are marching in open field, being fired on from behind the walls. The Anglos are firing behind the walls. Is the Mexican casualties are higher. So even though every single Texan dies in the battle, it's often portrayed as somehow at least a spiritual victory. That in losing somehow Texas wins. And the argument is that delay that gave the Battle of the Alamo, gave Sam Houston time to gather his troops for the final battle of the war, which was in San Jacinto. Actually, it was a terrible decision of the Texans to have troops at the Alamo. Sam Houston was begging for them to abandon the fort and join his forces. But anyway, another aspect of the myth about the Alamo is the fact that even though Texans and Mexicans both committed war crimes, the slaughter of the survivors, the fact that no one was allowed to surrender at the battle, none of the Anglos, is often told as a story to indicate how ruthless, bloodthirsty, lacking in mercy Mexicans supposedly are by their character, and the contributions of Tejanos in that battle are almost forgotten and erased. You will have, after the Texans lose that battle, a battle cry will be, "Remember the Alamo." And then we will have another, this painting is also famous from the war, the Texas Revolution. This is the surrender. What happens is Sam Houston's forces assault Santa Anna's forces in San Jacinto. It is during a siesta. Santa Anna's troops are attacked by surprise. They didn't expect them. And the battle's over in, as I recall, 18 minutes. And overwhelming Mexican casualties versus Texan casualties. Santa Anna is actually captured. He's the president of Mexico, and he's a general of the army. So they have Santa Anna, who is depicted here, right here in the white pants. Sam Houston got an injury. He's on the ground recovering from a foot injury. He's a captive. He's a prisoner of war. And Texans have captured the president of the Mexican Republic. Their Texas troops are calling to execute Santa Anna. And then they say, let's negotiate a peace treaty. And so while he's a prisoner of war, he's going to sign away Texas. He's going to agree to Texas independence. And that will be a treaty that Mexico never recognizes as legitimate. They will, throughout this period, they'll say that treaty was coerced, and Santa Anna, by the way, he had been overthrown already in Mexico as president. Someone already replaced him as president. So this really does become a hardship for the Tejanos who even supported the war. It was elite, wealthy Tejanos, Mexican citizens, who had allied themselves with the Anglos in the war. And one of the provisions of the treaty that that the land grants, the understanding was that Mexican titles to land would be recognized. But you will see after this in the Mexican-American War that Anglos will use the court systems they set up, eventually American court systems, to invalidate the land claims that Tejanos had, their title to their land. They'll be made landless, and even wealthier Tejanos will end up being basically poor and workers after this is over. So behind all this is, of course, the desire to expand the territory where slavery is legal. Both Andrew Jackson and Sam Houston were interested in that. The enslavers in the South were aware of something. Cotton cultivation exhausts the soil. Monoculture agriculture, where you grow one crop over and over and over again and use every inch of land you have to do it, depletes the soils of the nutrients that plant depends on. The soil benefits from being allowed to lay fallow where nothing is grown for a season, and nutrients return. Native grasses, other plants grow. They add nutrition to the soil. Southern cotton plantation owners never allowed that to happen. They just used the soil, and then that soil became exhausted, and they would have to find new land. They'd have to reestablish their plantations elsewhere. And they realized that this was expensive, and the only way they think that slavery can survive and cotton cultivation can survive is to keep moving west. This is going to create a desire to find new slave territory. And Southerners are going to push, for instance, for the United States to take Cuba from Spain and make it a U.S. territory. There will be efforts to establish American colonies in Central America with the purpose of establishing plantations there for Southern growers. And in fact, there are some attempts to do that. A man named William Walker will go to Central America to try to establish, these expeditions were called filibusters. It's not like the Senate filibuster. That's the term they use for these expeditions that grab land for the United States. Bear in mind, too, that there was a desire on the part of Southerners to create new slave states to maintain the balance of power between free states and slave states in the U.S. Senate. So there's this constant pressure. And enslavers are beginning to worry about the growing numbers of abolitionists, and that worry is only going to deepen in 1842 with the Supreme Court decision, Prigg versus Pennsylvania. That decision relieves the state, any state official, of responsibility for capturing escaped slaves or alleged escaped slaves. It no longer becomes the responsibility of states to do it. The U.S. Constitution makes the federal government responsible for doing it. But what had been happening is some states felt coerced to, because of the political power of slave owners, to do that function themselves. Now the Supreme Court says you don't have to. If the U.S. wants to do it, they better appoint marshals to do it, federal marshals. In fact, that will come up in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850. Now, this led to the first big calls on the part of Southerners for a federal fugitive slave law that would actually put teeth and specifics to that one clause in the Constitution that made the federal government responsible for that. Meanwhile, anti-slavery congressmen are going to call for an end to the bullying and the buying and selling of enslaved African Americans in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. They say this is an embarrassment. We're supposed to be a republic, a democracy, a beacon of freedom to the world. People uniquely connected to God. That's how they saw themselves. And the fact that that's going on within hundreds of feet of the Capitol or the White House was just a humiliating thing for anti-slavery people. And the Texas Revolution, Texas, most of the white leadership in Texas had hoped to be annexed by the United States, a new state, a new slave state. In fact, for 9 years, free state congressmen including Abraham Lincoln, by the way, who would be against later in the 1840s. He's going to be in the Congress. He's going to be opposed to the addition of slave states. You will have many congressmen in the 1830s. Lincoln's not in the Congress at that point, but many congressmen in the 1830s who will, in the 1840s, who will say, no, we're not going to annex Texas. This is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy to add slave states. 9 years, Texas ends up being an independent republic. And that's supposed to be a point of pride for Texans. But the reason they're a republic is because they were trying to become a slave state. So this is going to just increase the tensions. And these tensions are really going to become explosive and lead to another moment where in 1850 the U.S. almost goes into civil war again. The tensions between the United States and Mexico reach a boiling point. Both Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren hesitated about annexing Texas. And there's a lot of northern opposition, but Martin Van Buren, who becomes president after Andrew Jackson, is also worried this could split the Democratic Party. That northern Democrats and southern Democrats would form separate parties if Texas is annexed. So they held off. And so that's the period of the Republic. Then a man named John Tyler is vice president. In 1841, he was vice president for William Henry Harrison, who had been an army general. He's a member of the Whig Party. The Whig Party, let me write down the name of that party because it's spelled strangely. The Whig Party was the party that opposed the Democrats. It was the other major party. There had been two major parties at the beginning of the American Republic, that formed while Washington was president. One party was called the Federalist Party. The other party was called, confusingly enough, the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party scratch that. The two parties were the Whig Party, or the Federalist Party. That's the party of Washington, it's the party of John Adams, etc. The other party was actually called the Republican Party. It's not the Republican Party we have today. This party becomes the Democratic Party. So that's a little confusing. But anyway, so these are the two parties. The Federalist Party never made an effort to really appeal to the common person. They were a party of elites. And so what happens is this party ceases to exist after the War of 1812. And for a while, for several years, there's only one political party in the U.S. There are factions within it. It's the Republican Party. By the time Andrew Jackson becomes president, this has become known as the Democratic Party. Now, the Federalists had been big into, national unity, developing infrastructure, using federal money to build bridges. They'll later on, after the 1820s, they'll support railroad projects, dams, et cetera, et cetera. They want a strong national government. They're not keen on the idea of states' rights. The Federalists don't exist anymore, but people with those ideas in the 1830s formed the Whig Party, which is the opposition to the Democrats. Why do they call themselves the Whigs? That's the name of a party in England that believed that the Parliament should have more power than the King. They call themselves that because they believe that Andrew Jackson thinks of himself as a king. It's trolling. And so the Whigs always had a problem. There are Southern Whigs, there are Northern Whigs, and they can never figure out how to deal with the issue of slavery. They took one stand or the other, they'd lose half of their support. So the Whig approach was to always nominate military heroes as president. And they talk about his military record, and they'd avoid saying anything about slavery, even though it was the most important issue. The Democrats had such a lock on the South that they had a big advantage in the Electoral College. They were guaranteed to win there, even though they were Southern Whigs. They were Southern Whigs. So the Whig Party nominates a war hero, a general that fought Native Americans, William Henry Harrison. He's sworn in. Back then, presidents were sworn in March. And he's delivering a speech that lasts 3 or 4 hours. And it's the area around Washington, D.C. There's all kinds of garbage. There was a lot of animal waste. The water was dirty. So he might have caught a disease just in the contaminated atmosphere. Some people think he got pneumonia because he spoke without a hat during a cold day while it was raining. He gets sick right after his inaugural speech. 30 days later, he's dead. That's his entire presidency. His vice president was Tyler, as I said, who was a slave owner from Virginia. And Tyler wanted to add, he was hated, by the way, Tyler, by almost everybody. He serves almost the entire term Harrison was elected to. He wants to add a slave state to the Union. There were already all kinds of economic ties between Texas and the United States. So he knew it would be a problem. He was hoping that Southerners may line up behind him if he advocated Texas statehood and he'd get nominated, but the Whig Party didn't nominate him for president in 1844. So Tyler's Secretary of State was a man named John C. Calhoun, we've talked about before. Calhoun releases a letter to the press, and he comes out and says the quiet part out loud. He says, we want to annex Texas in order to protect slavery, and he says that's an institution essential to peace, safety, and prosperity for the whole country. Well, a lot of free state voters didn't think that way. And so that kind of, really made the possibility of a treaty being signed with the Republic of Texas. It's a foreign country at that point for the United States. A treaty signed between Texas and the United States would require a 2/3 vote in the Senate. They can't get 2/3 of the vote, especially after what Calhoun said. Anti-slavery forces in the Senate have enough vote to block that. So that's an issue during the 1844 campaign. You're going to have Henry Clay, who was a national, he was a strong Whig, wanted national projects, infrastructure, etc. He easily wins the nomination. He is not fond of the idea of Texas annexation. And so we have this, but nevertheless, there's a competing idea that becomes really strong. Manifest Destiny. This is promoted by a newspaper editor at the time. This is the idea that Anglo-Saxons, as they called themselves at that point, they believed themselves racially pure people who had come originally from Germany, became the rulers of Great Britain, and then reached the United States. They believed they were destined to be the greatest power on earth because of their racial supremacy. The idea of Manifest Destiny is we were destined to rule North America, meaning Anglo-Saxons, white people. And in fact, it was even part of the divine plan. The reason the English colonists got to North America is because God set aside this land supposedly for white people and protected it with 2 oceans on either side. That was part of the divine project. So this becomes a popular idea. One man who advocates U.S. expansion, believes in Manifest Destiny, another Tennessee slave owner named James K. Polk, is going to get the Democratic nomination for president. He's going to be all for not only annexing Texas, but getting more land from Mexico, including California and Oregon, which is claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. So this is a popular idea. Tyler wasn't nominated by his party for president. He's a lame duck. Polk's going to get elected in November. You don't swear in the new president in that era until 5 months later in March. So while he's a lame duck, he's eager to leave some kind of legacy. His presidency is pretty pathetic. And so he has his allies in the Congress submit a joint resolution rather than a treaty, where the Congress votes, and all that takes is a simple majority in the House and Senate. The treaty would have had to have a 2/3 approval by the Senate to accept Texas as a state. Congress passes the resolution in March 1845. Texas becomes the 15th state in the Union. Actually, that's not correct. It becomes a state in the Union December 1845. Now, let's go look at the map again. So I want you to see this. Okay, so here we go. This is the Republic of Texas. That now is part of the United States. Polk, who's the new president, wants California. And just north of here is Oregon. Polk wants to focus on getting California. He doesn't want, there's a threat of a war with Oregon, Great Britain over Oregon. They actually negotiate with Great Britain. They draw the border at the 49th parallel. That means any possibility of war against Great Britain or war with Great Britain dissipates. And so now the focus is on Mexican territory. All this vast territory here. So, Mexico is in chaos. As I mentioned last time, since achieving independence in 1821, Mexico had experienced little but political chaos. I talked about the 2 big factions in Mexican politics. A group called Centralists, who wanted most of the power in the Mexican government in the hands of the federal government in Mexico City, and for the states of Mexico to have less power than the federal government. Then there were the Federalists, He wanted the state to be, or the nation to be kind of a confederation, I guess you'd say, where states have the most of the power and the central government has less power. And this conflict goes back and forth. And between 1833 and 1855, power swings back and forth between the centralists and the federalists. And in this 22-year period, power changed hands 36 total times. 36 different governments in 22 years. And as I mentioned last time, presidents stay in office an average of only 7.5 months. You have many areas really controlled by indigenous people. The Maya constantly have armed resistance against the Mexican government. That's in the Yucatan Peninsula, near Central America. The Yaqui Indians in the northwestern part of Mexico. This area here fight armed resistance against the Mexican government, trying to maintain their freedom and independence. They're never completely under the control of the Mexican government. And by the way, there have been resistance movements to the Mexican government by the Maya late 20th century, early 21st century. Santa Anna, the man who lost Texas, rose to the presidency of Mexico 11 different times in this time period. He's corrupt, he's arrogant, he's incompetent, and under his leadership, Mexico will eventually lose a total of 50% of its territory. Now, Polk wants to provoke a war. He does make an effort, a half-hearted one, to buy all this territory, to buy half of Mexico. He sends a negotiator to buy specifically California and modern-day New Mexico for $30 million. He knew that that probably wouldn't be accepted. But he wanted to show the world, well, I tried, right? And so he basically says, you know, Mexico, this is what we're offering. Mexico says no, and he takes that as a war-like provocation. At the same time, in January 1846, he sends a general, Zachary Taylor, and troops to here. The Nueces River, this here, it extends here. He sends them there. That has always been the southern border of Tejas, or Texas, under the Mexican Republic. That was the southernmost border along this area here. And then Coahuila is to the south. He tells the troops, cross the river. Texans, Anglo-Texans had always said the border should be the Rio Grande. But Mexico never accepted that. Said, send them there, march to the Rio Grande, where he knew there were Mexican soldiers. So they go ahead, they march, they cross the river. Polk had already written a declaration of war based on Mexico's rejection of the monetary offer for all that territory. And he was about to send it to Congress, asking for a declaration of war, when the U.S. troops crossed the Nueces. Mexican troops see an invading force. Their country is being invaded. They fire. 11 American soldiers are killed by Mexico while these soldiers are invading Mexico. It's self-defense. Polk gets word about this, and then he sends a message to Congress saying that Mexico had invaded U.S. territory and were engaged in aggression against the United States, and the Congress overwhelmingly approves the declaration of war. This will be, for many American military officers, a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. They're going to have 8,000 regular troops, the U.S. Army, 60,000 soldiers from state militias, and they have a much bigger Navy than Mexico does. And you're going to have future Civil War generals and leaders like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses Grant, P.G.T. Beauregard, George McClellan, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, who becomes the president of the Confederacy, all are going to be officers and achieve prominence in the Mexican-American War. Zachary Taylor is going to roll up a lot of big victories in northern Mexico very quickly. American troops seize what is now the American Southwest, modern-day states of Arizona and New Mexico. And in June 1846, American settlers in California, led by John C. Fremont, raise a flag, the Bear flag. They declare the Bear flag republic. They claim control. California is a republic too for a short time. Texans don't realize that. The U.S. Pacific Fleet seizes California's port, and the Mexican port city of Monterrey. By 1847, California and New Mexico are under American control. Now, I will end by asking you to think about this. Look at the border. This is the modern U.S. border. This territory here in blue is bought by the U.S. in 1853. Santa Anna is president again, and he agrees to sell that territory to the United States, which is usually impossible, and he's overthrown again. And Santa Anna, by the way, was president during the Mexican-American War. So, yeah, bad news for Mexico. American troops get all the way to Mexico City. Most of the country, they've invaded. Why do they not take all that territory? Why don't they go all the way south? It's off the map. It'd be here. Why don't they make all of Mexico part of U.S. territory? It's because of racism. You know, when we say racism shaped American history, it shaped America. The reason they draw this boundary here, much further north of the deepest south they got, the reason they did that is they don't want to have more Native Americans and all these Mexicans as part of their population. It's actually in congressional debates. You actually have members of Congress saying, we already have two inferior races in our borders, those of African descent and Indians. The Mexicans are also inferior, and they're not used to slavery. And we would have to enslave millions of Mexicans to keep them under control, and they are a low-grade population, these white people in Congress are going to say. That's draw the boundary so we get the most Mexican territory with the least number of Mexicans. That's literally how the southern border that we now think is so sacred was drawn. And it's going to be something that's going to be a major problem, and Ralph Waldo Emerson will say that this acquisition, this Mexican territory, there will be opposition to the war. Particularly a group of thinkers and writers centered in New England called the Transcendentalists. Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of them. And he's going to basically describe the territory that the U.S. conquered from Mexico as poison that can kill the Union. Because, once again, we have a big debate. What are we going to do about slavery in all this area? And what's going to be a big problem is California. Why? The Missouri Compromise line goes roughly from here to here, cuts through California, splits it in half, and the white people who end up living in California, and they're going to be drawn in huge numbers because of an event that happens in 1849, 1 year after the Mexican-American War is over, are not going to want slavery. Southerners are going to want to force slavery on California. Or they want to split in half. Californians don't want to be split in half. And this will be another moment where we almost went to civil war. We'll talk about that next time.